All right, we might as well get started. So today's lecture, we're basically going to apply the approach that we described in words last lecture. So in particular, this exit comparables based valuation of a startup. I'm going to actually start sharing my slides right now. And I'll be kind of going back and forth between my slides, maybe a little bit of the board, and some Excel today. Can you guys see my slides now?
Yeah.
Perfect. I just need to make this a little bit bigger. Right. So this was the slide that I believe we wrapped things up with last lecture. But the thing that's going to be important to get out of today's lecture in terms of doing things via example is going to be the fact that the way we implement this exit comparables based valuation is going to be changing over the life cycle of a startup. So the way we do it for a super early stage startup is going to be different from, right, when I say super early stage, really we're thinking about this like pre-product, pre-going to market, right? Versus when a company has started going to market, has maybe a little bit of traction, but doesn't really have that much operating history for us to try to make very refined predictions on whether it's going to be like an all-star or the opposite of an all-star, not a non-star in this market. And then versus kind of later on when this company's been performing in the market for long enough that we can start to tell whether it's better than the rest or worse than the rest, so on and so forth. Let me just quickly close my door here. So that it can be 28 degrees in my office instead of 25. But in any case, so that's going to be really our objective, is to try to start getting a bit of a nuanced feel of how we actually go and do this in the real world, and how it's not one size fits all. And I'm going to try to illustrate this via concrete examples. So as I've said before, our concrete examples are going to be drawn by Dropbox Valuations over the course of its own life cycle. And what you end up seeing is that the narrative that they form in their life cycle, over their life cycle, really evolves and becomes more and more detailed. And that greater detail in the narrative gets reflected in subtly different ways that we go in and we implement our comparables-based valuation. Okay, so again, this may seem all vague to you right now. Absolutely, it seems vague because we haven't started doing it yet. Okay, so let's go ahead and start doing this. But what I want to highlight is that we really are going to want to think about this as a life cycle evaluation. So I'll do the examples first, and then at the end, I'll try to synthesize what I mean by this life cycle evaluation. Okay? All right, let's go. Whoops. Right, so as we had said before, and maybe I'll just quickly recap it again, what do I mean by exit comparables-based valuation? It's a 4-step process, right? The first step is that you pick an appropriate set of comparables. But remember, when I say comparable, in an exit comps valuation, it's exit comparables. So we try to find companies in the market right now, or historical companies, right, that at some point in time were comparable not to what our startup is right now, but to what we hope our startup will become in the future, i.e. at exit, if things go well, if we're successful. Where I define success as, having, either an IPO or an acquisition-based exit, right? Those are the companies we look for. One usual suspect here would be like, looking for companies that are publicly traded that are in our industry, but they're publicly traded, so they've already succeeded. Right? So they're not comparable to us right now. They are much more mature than us, right? By the way, I should highlight, this is precisely why we have to start getting cute like this with our comparables-based valuation, because the most natural source of data for us comes from public markets, right? Remember I said when I described the current comparables-based valuation, you usually get your data from public markets. The reason why you get your data from public markets is because it is public. Companies' values are known on a frequent basis, and they're required to make regular disclosures of their financials, which allow us to get attributes. The reason we get most of our data on comps from public markets is not because we think public markets are the best source of perfect comps. It's because it's the only place we can really reliably get data on, right? And because we recognize that in the context of valuing a startup, we know there's no such thing as a company in the public market that resembles our startup. Our startup is a puny little fruit fly right now, right? And those things are like tarantulas, right? I know it's a different species, but whatever. We need to make adjustments to make this thing all work in terms of a proper valuation. And so what we realize is, well, look, we don't want to use exit comparables the way we would use current comparables, which was the process, the three-step process that we had described earlier in these notes last lecture, right? But what can we use this for? Well, the clever observation is that we can use the average multiple among our exit comps. Well, we can use that to get an exit valuation if things go well by multiplying by our exit attribute, right? For instance, if our attribute is revenue, what do we think our revenue will be at exit, at time t, if things go well? Multiplying that number, which does require us to make a forecast, right? It's a forecast conditional on success. Well, once we've made that forecast, and once we have this target exit multiple, well, by definition, multiplying the two together in a similar logic for what we did with current comps, well, this gives us not a current value, it gives us the exit value conditional on success, which was precisely the number that we were missing to be able to go full circle on a valuation using the VC method. So we take this, plug it into the VC method, which we discussed last week, or no, the week before actually. Okay, I don't remember exactly when we discussed it. It was some point in the past. It is videos posted online, but we plug that in, discounted by the VC discount rate, and that gives us our company value today, right? That's our process here.
Jiro,
Go ahead, yes.
so I have two quick questions on this. The first is, we're valuing it conditional on success. So is it fair to say, I know you said you define success as either an IPO or an acquisition. Is it fair to say that any company that is in the public market, is considered successful by that definition?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, look, we can, people can start to debate what sample of data you want to start to build, right? So maybe, do you look at all public companies in your industry? Do you zone in a little bit tighter on what you do? Do you only look at the public companies that were previously venture-backed? Or do you look at all companies, whether they were venture-backed or not? Like, these are kind of secondary judgment calls, right? That different people will quibble on, to be honest. And most of the time when they're quibbling, it's because they have different interests. So like, I do the calculation looking at only venture-backed, and I get a valuation of 50 million. You do it using all companies, you get 40 million. Probably what it means is I'm aligned with the seller and you're aligned with the buyer. To be honest, I mean, that's just kind of how it works, right? When there's discretion, people kind of think what is best for them or their team or their client or yada, yada, right? Look, this is something that you see everywhere in finance, right? Like, there's all this hidden discretion, right? You can try to do it in a good faith manner, but good faith will only take you so far. At the end of the day, you're going to get to a point where you're like, I could probably do it this way or that way or that. And it's not obvious which one's the best one. So, it's not science. Let's put it that way, right? It's, we like to think of it as part science, but, emphasis on part. But yeah, let's go ahead and start doing some of these valuations. So we're going to think about valuations of Dropbox at different key moments in its life. And we're going to start early and get progressively later in Dropbox's life. So we're going to start in September 2007. In September 2007, here's the information that we know about Dropbox. Dropbox is raising a seed investment round from VCs. In particular, they end up raising $1.2 million at a $5 million post-money valuation from Sequoia. So far, Dropbox has made progress on their product development, and they have a working beta, though the back end of their product isn't ready to scale. They need more funds to be able to achieve that. As a result, they haven't publicly launched, right? So they're trying to raise money, literally no product in the hands of the public. This is a difficult product to build. If you recall earlier in the semester, when I talked about MVP design by Dropbox, right, I explained that there were a lot of Dropbox competitors at the time who launched with shitty products that didn't work well, right? Dropbox decided that they were going to launch with a good product that wouldn't randomly delete your files. I mean, I had that experience with a company called SugarSync, which was the company I used before I transitioned to Dropbox. Yeah, and they would delete my files completely unexpectedly. 100,000 files would become 95,000 files. Dropbox did not want that because they knew if I had that user experience, the moment I could move to something more trustworthy, I would be gone. And I left SugarSync without looking back at all, right? Because I hadn't been happy with the experience. But they needed to raise money for that, which is why they're raising a funding round. But they do have some evidence of success. And this goes back to the MVPs that they actually did launch, which was their demo videos, right? The fact that they launched demo videos, that they got, meaningful signups to product beta lists and stuff like that, suggested to investors that they did have some go-to-market chops. They had, with no marketing budget, gotten themselves, a sign-up list of several thousands of people, right? And they had been scrappy, right? To be able to learn about what you should be doing without launching a product, respect, right? Definitely Sequoia gave them respect for that. So what were, again, as I said, their evidence of success at this point? They'd launched their product demo, and that went viral in their intended beachhead market. They had also made a really good impression on someone that VCs respect a lot in terms of his opinion, which was the founder of Y Combinator, Paul Graham. So if Paul Graham says, these folks are talented, VCs will listen. So this is the information that we had. In addition to that, what else did we know? We know at this point in time, cloud storage is a very competitive market. It's not like a secret. It's not like Drew Houston is like the first person ever to think about, cloud storage, stuff. There's, I believe, another 20 companies navigating in this in these waters. Companies like Box, SugarSync, Mozy. But there is one fact, most people, unlike me, were not stupid enough to use those products. So there is not much market penetration yet. Let's put it that way. So this is what we know qualitatively about the company so far. So the question is, holy cow, how do you do a valuation of this company? Doesn't sound like we got a lot of information, right?
I had a question qualitatively though, because if they're basing their company on the fact that they would be sort of a more reliable product, that they don't actually have a product like fully launched, how can they say that? Like how can
they say what?
Why would the market believe them?
Why would the market believe them what? Sorry, can you repeat that?
Because they're basing their product on being a more reliable product, but the whole product hasn't been released yet. Why would I believe them?
Well, I mean, they're pretty fucking smart. I mean, you know, they were like top students at MIT, and they've managed to actually build something that works reasonably well, just not at scale yet. And they have a lot of clarity on like why they're not ready to launch and what they need to do to make it work at a greater scale. They're able to explain it, and they know that they're not ready, which is, you know, better than some of the other cowboys at Sugar Sync. So, yeah, look, I mean, at the end of the day, you size up a team for their technical competency, and that's relevant on whether you believe they can build a product. So people definitely did that. And, you know, at this stage, Dropbox is two people. It's Drew Houston and Arash Fardowsi, right? But those people know their stuff. They know their stuff, right? So what are we going to do? We're going to do our valuation, and I'll show you guys some data that I use to base this valuation. Okay, so I'm now going to switch from this slide to my Excel spreadsheet, if I can figure out. Okay, there we go. How do I change my share? New share. Can you see my spreadsheet now? Okay, good. Sorry, every time I share some new thing, all my windows for Zoom just vanish and show up in new places. So in any case, let's take a look at this stuff. I have 3 valuations here, but in the interest of time, I will actually only focus on one of them. One of them is like pretty rarely used, which is valuation 1. So look, I'm looking for comps. You guys shouldn't be surprised that I'm doing a comps-based valuation. I'm looking for comps. And I look at 2 places for my comps. One is recent exits in Dropbox's space, right? Oh, well, you know, there was a company doing what Dropbox is planning to do. They just got sold for this amount, right? That's material information. And so there was one exit in this space at that time, which was a company called Mozy, had been acquired by EMC for $76 million. Now, you'd have to be insane to think that that means Dropbox was worth $76 million. So that's definitely not the case. But there's some nuance in how you go adjust that data point to try to get a proper valuation for Dropbox. This is a pretty rare thing for you to be able to do, because most of the time when you're an early stage startup, there isn't another company in your space that's already been acquired. That's actually pretty rare. And so because of that, I'm actually going to skip this nuance because it's just less useful at a practical level, and it doesn't go to the core of what a standard comps-based valuation will look like. If anyone is interested in this, I am available in office hours to talk through it, okay? But I want to go instead to a more standard exit comps-based valuation, where instead of looking at companies that are super, super close to Dropbox that have exited recently, instead we go and look more at these exit comps, right? Which is basically companies that are already publicly traded that have had IPO exits in the past, because every IPO creates public data. So we can compute a multiple at the IPO for any historical IPO. But the problem is there's no company that is exactly like Dropbox that has had an IPO yet, right? So we can't get too similar. Beggars cannot be choosers. Let's always remember that, right? And beggars cannot be choosers. So we're not going to go and try to pick something too close to Dropbox. We'll pick something that's like loosely similar to Dropbox. And, you know, emphasis on loose. I mean, unfortunately, we can't do better than that. And I'm going to do this 2 times. So my second and third approach, like the procedure is going to be identical in both cases. It's just I'm going to use a different set of comparables. In valuation 2, I'm going to use a really broad set of comparables. I'm going to use all recent tech company IPO valuations. So I look at every tech company that's gone public over the last 5 years, and I compute their average multiple when they went public. Right? We can all see this is data. If you're willing to put in the labor, it's data you can get. Right? Good news. Well, at least good news for me that I didn't have to do it. There's a very nice and well-regarded academic in at the University of Florida. His name is Jay Ritter. This is a link to his website where he keeps some IPO data. So he's done a lot of research on IPOs, and he shares a lot of his data, or at least summaries of his data, to the public. So if you ever want to have broad descriptions of IPOs, how many of them there were, what the valuations were, what the multiples were, you can actually go to his website. And that's what I did here. Remember, this is Dropbox in 2007. So I went and looked at the average exit value. Sorry, this is enterprise value at IPO. And also I looked at the average multiple of enterprise value to revenue, which is the most common multiple used for valuing startups when they exit, and basically just got that data. I take the average of these enterprise values. The average is 360 million. The average multiple is about 5.46. I also calculate an implied growth rate. So as we go from here to here, this translates to about a 6.5% growth rate per year, just so you know. So far, so good? So just remember 361 and a growth rate of 6.5% per year. So what am I going to do? Let me say the first thing that I'm going to do, because this is going to be weird. I'm actually not going to do a standard exit comps valuation here, because remember, in an exit comps valuation, you have target multiple times your attribute, right? You have target multiple times your attribute, meaning you're getting an estimate of your exit value that is conditional on your forecast of your exit size. I'm going to do it differently here. The problem is I have no way of even thinking about how I could forecast my exit revenue right now. The company just isn't even operating yet. It's not like I can start saying like, okay, you've had this history of revenue. Let's go and extrapolate that out. Can't do that because there's nothing that's happened yet. There's no data to extrapolate from, right? But also, I can't even do like a top-down revenue forecast because this market is so young that we don't even have much in terms of like forecasts of the future market size. So all the traditional things we would do to forecast revenue, not available to us here. So if I were to present to you a revenue forecast model, you should not believe me. You should be like, Jiro just kind of did this, you know? And you don't want me to do that, right? So what am I going to do instead? I'm going to do something that's still a comparables-based valuation, but it won't be based off of a multiple. I'll just be looking at the average exit value of these IPOs at exit, right? So I'm just saying like, hey, look, you know, over the past 5 years, the average has been 361 million. And I'm going to use that instead of a multiple. That de facto says like, I have no business guessing whether Dropbox will be higher than average or lower than average. So I'm just going to take the average. Are we okay so far? So I'm taking this 361 million, but I'm going to assume that this is going to grow at 6.5% per year over the next, you know, now until Dropbox exit. Now, Dropbox here is a typical seed stage investment. If we go and look back at part 1 of this topic, if you look in the slides, I gave you guys data. The average seed stage investment is about 6 years away from exit. So I'm going to say, look, you know, if the average exit value now is 361 million, and that grows by 6.5% per year, in 6 years, right? In 6 years, this is our 6.5%. The average exit value should be about 527.9 million. See what I'm saying? Like, I don't want to just take that historical average and not grow it, because we know IPOs generally grow over time. The average IPO in 1926 was way lower than the average IPO now, right? So it would be crazy to assume that number doesn't grow. So I looked at the historical data just over the last 5 years to just project some sort of growth, because we expect that. Because remember, these companies are exiting in several years, right? So even though 6.5% maybe doesn't sound that big, look at the big impact that it has over this period. That's a pretty substantial difference. But there's another problem. Do you think an IPO is a typical exit? Or do you think it's higher than the normal exit or lower than the normal exit? The most successful companies, do they get acquired or do they have an IPO usually?
IPO.
Like, not even close. I mean, this is, you know, you can always find exceptions to statements like this. But as an average statement, it's like a big time delta. Now, given that statement, if I went and put 527 million into the VC method, would you think I'm overvaluing Dropbox or undervaluing Dropbox? Not a trick question, but if someone could answer it would be great.
Overvaluing?
Overvaluing, right? Look, the analogy is the following. It would be like assuming that every time someone hit a baseball, they were hitting a grand slam. If you made that assumption incorrectly, you would dramatically overvalue this baseball player, right? You'd be like, wow, that's like the best slugging percentage of all time. Yeah, you'd be way too high because you're assuming every exit is this just like amazing outcome. And so we want to ratchet that number down to reflect the possibility of an acquisition-based exit, correct? So for this, I used some data, okay? So I went into the Sandhill data and I looked. If you compare IPO exits that occur, you know, in the aftermath of a seed stage investment, and you compare acquisition exits that happen in the aftermath of a seed stage investment, it turns out the average acquisition exit is 1/3 the size of the average IPO. That's what I mean, that it's a big difference. So on average, we expect an IPO exit to be about 528 million, and the average acquisition exit to be 176 million.
Jiro,
Yes?
just so I understand what that actually, like how that 527 would have been calculated, or like where those numbers would have came from. Is that what IPO allocations were given at on average, right? Like if you think about just number of shares distributed times price of share, or is that after the pop? Like where is that?
That is the enterprise value of the whole company. You know, if you assume that every share is worth what the IPO shares were sold at.
Okay, so it's the IPO share. So the night before the IPO, people who got allocations, that's what the price per share there is that what is being used in the calculation of enterprise value?
To be honest, Mike, I do not actually know in this very specific data whether this 527 million is off of the last private transaction, which is the IPO price, or if it's based off of the first public trade price, or if it's end of the closing day of the first day. It could be one of those three. And all three would be viewed to me as being semi-reasonable.
Okay. Okay.
So, and Jay Ritter doesn't, I mean, I don't remember. It's been a long time since I've looked at it. Your point is well taken that this is, it's good to know what that detail is. To be honest, if I was doing it, I would take closing price of first day trading. I wouldn't take the IPO allocation price because the VCs are not selling at that time. They're selling later, right? And we know that there's an, not everyone in this class necessarily knows, but it is well known in practice that there's something called IPO underpricing. And because of IPO underpricing, if you mark the whole company on that underpriced thing, you're going to undervalue. So I would be surprised if he took actually the last private. My guess is it's first public or end of first day public.
Thank you.
No problem. Divide by 3,175. So we know that the average exit value is somewhere between those two numbers, correct? How do we get the exact number between? Well, we need to go and take the probability of success and split it between IPO success and acquisition success. Turns out I have that data as well, again, from the Sandhill data. So I had shown you guys earlier, this was in part 1 of this topic, that for a seed stage investment, the average seed stage investment has an exit 31% of the time. That 31 is split 10 and 21 between IPO and acquisition. So given that information, we can take a conditional average of these two possibilities, right? Because the average exit value allowing for both IPO or acquisition is what? It's the average exit value conditional on an IPO times the conditional probability of an IPO given a successful exit, which is the probability of an IPO divided by the probability of an IPO plus the probability of an acquisition. This is just a conditional probability. I think you guys take a basic statistics probability course, probably in U0 or something. That's back to those days, okay? Sorry, this got a little bit small. Oh, shoot. Okay, sorry about that, folks. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. And then, right, so this is the conditional probability of an IPO given success times the conditional average IPO exit value given success, plus this is the conditional probability of an acquisition given success, which is probability acquisition divided by probability IPO plus probability acquisition, times the average exit value conditional on an IPO. And so when you take that probability weighted average, you get an average exit value of 289 million. And we plug that into the VC method. So 289 million divided by 1 plus D to the power of T. The average D for a seed stage investment is about 0.8. And the T is 6 years. That gives us 8.5 million, but that's the value of the company without its cash. It all of a sudden has 1.2 million in cash. So we add the 1.2 million in cash and that gives us 9.7 million. So this is our first valuation of Dropbox. Now you'll notice this number looks pretty high because I said Dropbox raised for 5 million, right? So we might want to think, why in the world would Dropbox have accepted that if they could have done this calculation, which by the way, they could have done it because all the data I'm using was available to them at that time. There's a very simple reason. There's actually 2 reasons. One reason I'm not going to model in the math. They're raising money from Sequoia. Sequoia is much better at helping them add value. Sequoia charges for that. The way they charge for that is they lowball the valuation a bit. They know if they make a valuation offer that's like 15% lower than a far lesser known VC firm, they're probably going to win, right? So when they're raising at 5 million, they're giving the Sequoia discount. That's one part of it. But that's not the only part. The other part is, as I had told you, this is a super competitive market at this time. It is way more competitive than a typical startup market. And because of that, would you think the probability of success is higher than normal or lower than normal? Again, not meant to be subtle.
Lower.
Lower, right? What do you think happens to the correct value of the VC discount rate that you should use if the probability of success falls? Should D go up or should D go down? D should go up if you think this lowers the valuation. D should go down if you think this increases the valuation. Lower probability of success does what to the valuation? It lowers it, right? And so we can make an adjustment to the value to reflect the lower possibility of success because it's just a more intensely competitive market. So as I said, historically, for the average VC seed stage investment, success probability is 31%. If you think like every company in the cloud storage market has half that likelihood of success because there's so many more of them, then maybe you think there's a 15.5% probability of success. Now, it turns out if you express a view like this on the probability of success, I think it's 15.5%, not 31%. There's a very simple impact on the pre-money valuation of the startup. You just take the value that you get with the normal rule of thumb D and you multiply it by the ratio of the probabilities. So you take your $8.5 million and you multiply it by 15.5% divided by 31%. You can mathematically prove this if you understand my formula for, what, remember I had like 1 plus D to the power of T equals to some messy expression. This was my like main formula in part 1 of these notes. If you really understand that, you can actually see that my statement here is a mathematically correct statement. It's a mathematical proof, right? But here I just want to tell you it in a simple way, right? I don't want to be proving math stuff here. But if we think, the true probability of success is half the probability of success of a normal seed stage investment, then what you'll do is halve the value. So the pre-money valuation is going to go from 8.5 million to 4.25 million. But then, of course, cash is still cash. So you'll add the cash, the 1.2, and that gives you 5.45 million. Folks okay with this? That's not a crazy number. I mean, you take this and you reduce it by 10%, you get to the 5 million. That's kind of, if anything, seems like a small Sequoia discount. Makes sense to me. Now, remember, we use the entire sample of technology IPOs, which might seem like way too broad a category for you. So if we want to not go really broad, our alternative could be to go more narrow. And one place that seems to make sense within the context of Dropbox to look more narrow is to look at just SaaS IPOs that have already happened at this time. You guys see what I'm saying? Right? Because at this time, we've already had some SaaS IPOs. Salesforce has gone public, for instance. So we could look all historical IPOs that were in the software as a service space, because guess what? Dropbox is software as a service. So I'm going to get an average enterprise value at exit using the sample of historical SaaS IPOs. Unfortunately, with the SaaS IPOs, Jay isn't collecting that yet. So that one I had to go do manually myself. So I collect the data of all SaaS IPOs from 2004. I actually go and collect it all the way up to 2015. I'm not going to use the data after 2007 here. Okay, I just collected it so that we can use it for future problems, okay? But as of 2007, we've got these IPOs so far. Salesforce right now, Vocus, Taleo, DealerTrack, Demand Tech, and Omniture. So why don't we take the average of their enterprise values at IPO? So I take the average of those numbers. The average of those numbers gives me $415 million. I still want to grow that, and I'm growing it at the same 6.5%. So if I grow it at 6.5% for 6 years, that brings me to 607 million. So far, so good? Still going to do that same. Everything now is the same calculation as before. Average acquisition is 1/3 of the average IPO. So I divide that by 3, 202. Then I take the probability weighted average between these two things using the conditional probabilities that I used before. And that gives me 332 million. With that 302 million, I plug it into VC method, add 1.2 million. So with no adjustment of failure probability, I get to $10.98 million. That's the case. You know, Drew and Arash were pretty generous. But we don't think that's the case. We think that, you know, everyone realizes like it's a tougher tougher market to enter because of all the competition. So continuing with our assumption of half the probability of success, we get pre-money valuation of 4.89 million, add the 1.2 million, it's about 6.1 million. Well, this starts to look actually quite sensible because you're worth 6.1 million, you give a $1.1 million discount to Sequoia, and it actually seems pretty legit. So, you know, maybe that's a little, you know, maybe a little bit more of a discount, so it seems like a slightly low number. But by the way, it's pretty common when you do these types of valuations and you compare it to the seed stage valuation that a startup typically gets, the startup typically gets a slightly lower number. And the reason is the VC has way more bargaining power because like most startup founders here are not established. And so they're kind of lucky if even one VC wants to invest in them. So it's not unusual that when you compare your valuation here with what a startup actually gets, the startup actually gets something a little bit lower, especially the ones that are going to prominent VCs. Any questions about this so far? Look, the thing I want you to recognize is that in this valuation, we didn't use attributes at all. And because we did not use attributes, I call this an unconditional exit-based comparables approach. Unconditional just means we didn't use an attribute. The whole point of an attribute is to say, well, you know what? The average startup exiting would have an exit revenue of 10 million, but I forecast that my startup will have twice that amount, 20 million. And because it'll have twice that amount, it should have twice the value. So we're conditioning on our forecast of the exit attribute. We're saying because we believe that's going to be 2 times higher, we should have 2 times the valuation. It's a conditional statement. This one was unconditional because we didn't take a stand on whether Dropbox will have an exit revenue that is higher or lower than normal. Any questions about this? All right. Well, then we can go to our next valuation. So I'm going to go back to, wait, I'm back to my big picture here, but now I'm going to go back to my slides.
Just while you're doing that, Jiro, one thing I quickly had a question on was, you gave the example, and obviously it was like a super large exaggeration of like, 1929, the IPOs were much smaller than, those of today. How, when you're looking for comps, how far can you go back without, skewing the data too much?
Yeah, honestly, like you're not going to get a uniform answer from people there. 5 years sounds about right to me. But
Okay.
but here's the thing: is this is kind of guided by needing kind of a reasonable amount of data points. So if we go through a period of 5 years where there's virtually no IPOs, then I've got no choice. I've got to go further back.
Okay.
I say this because we had some pretty low volume times on the IPO market and technology for several years. So it's kind of guided by the availability of data. But if availability of data isn't much of a concern, 5 years sounds about right to me.
Thank you.
No problem. But this is my personal rule, not a, survey other people too, not just me. By the way, the process that we did in solving this problem, right? You might have had difficulty following it a little bit, in which case that's understandable. I summarize it on this slide 13. Right? Adjusting IPO valuation data to account for acquisitions. You need to do that to get an unbiased outlook on exit, conditional, and success. And this is the formula I used. We take our IPO exit number, which was the first number we got. Then we adjust the IPO exit number down to get an acquisition exit number, where the parameter A here is the fraction that the average acquisition exit is of the average IPO exit. This was our 1/3 that I quoted in my spreadsheet. And then this is the conditional probability of an IPO given success. And this is the conditional probability of an acquisition given success. And unsurprisingly, you will see the sum of the probabilities is 1. Because if you're successfully exiting, you've either had an IPO or you've had an acquisition. Let's go to our next valuation. This next valuation is going to be more of a typical exit comparables based valuation, because we're going to actually use conditional. We're going to use the attribute. In particular, our attribute is going to be revenue. Okay, so let me read what's happening with Dropbox at this point in time. And to be honest, this will be my last valuation for today. I actually have 2 more, so I'm going to do those in our next lecture. Okay, but this is going to be our first real typical looking VC exit comps valuation. So let's read this. This is in October 2008, so it's about a year later. It's 13 months later. At this stage, Dropbox is raising a Series A investment round from VCs. Since their last fundraise, right, the September 2007, they've successfully launched a beta of their product. This has gone well. Users report few glitches, and the product is easy and intuitive to use. This is good news. Additionally, less than a month ago, they also officially launched to the public, and they quickly reached 100,000 users. This launch has gone smoothly as well, and their company is getting a lot of buzz from the tech media. When I say it's gone smoothly, remember what I was saying, the problems that SugarSync had, where files would disappear? This has not happened for Dropbox. Every user is pretty delighted. It's much easier to use than the SugarSyncs of the world. And it actually protects your files. Kind of a good thing. So they're showing that at least up to the scale of 100,000, even when it ramps up pretty fast, that things are okay for them. This is huge amounts of good news for VCs, because it shows their ability to generate a sign-up list, translate it to actual users, right? And their product works. So now's a good time to raise money. And so they raise money. So in particular, they actually end up raising a follow-on funding round from Sequoia, along with the participation of another major Bay Area VC called Excel. Excel is most notable for having been the first VC investor into Facebook. They raised $6 million now at a $29 million post-money valuation. We've got some additional information because you might say to yourself, well, Jiro, it's going to be difficult still for me to forecast revenue because the company's been in business on a limited, release for a month. How can we go and extrapolate, revenue from that? And my answer to that is, point well taken. I'm not going to do that. There's another thing that comes in handy right now, October 2008, when you guys were still children. But you guys were actually children at this time. Holy cow. Okay. Moreover, the cloud storage market is, you guys were younger than my daughter by like a lot. These are like the moments where you start to feel old. Moreover, the cloud storage market is starting to get hot, and tech research advisory firms have started to forecast the future market size of this market. I've got data on this in comps.x. Oh, it's no longer called comps.xls. I don't know what it's called at the moment, but I changed the name of the file. I provide some estimates of the market size, the size of the cloud storage market as forecasted by one of these consultancies that specialize in forecasting the future size of a market. And the company that I got this data from is IDC, known as it's known as IDC. Its full name is International Data Corporation. Why is this going to be useful? If you think about looking at someone's historical earnings and projecting from that, that's a little bit of what we call a bottom-up approach of forecasting your performance in the future. You look at the internal information on the company and you build it from there. An alternative approach that you can use to forecast revenue is to go top down, where you say to yourself, well, what's the overall size of the market over time? And what market share will I have? In this case, what market share will I have if I'm successful? Folks okay with this so far? So I'm going to use that data. So let's go back to sharing my Excel. And I'm going to go to my October 2008 tab. By the way, something to note for being able to navigate my spreadsheet for these valuations, you'll notice I've got some stuff in blue and some stuff in red. The stuff in red is data that I got, real world data. The stuff in blue is judgment calls I'm making. So if you want to understand what's happening, just know which is which, right? This is data. I got it from elsewhere, but it's real. And this is the judgment calls that get made. Look, now Dropbox is a Series A company. Average Series A exits in 5 years. So I need to forecast the market size in 5 years. And then I need to get a market share for Dropbox conditional on success. Multiply those two together. That gives me a revenue for Dropbox conditional on success. Folks okay with those statements? So I'm just giving you guys the facts. The IDC forecast of the cloud storage market says that they forecast the cloud storage market to be $715 million in 3 years. Now the thing is, I don't want the market size in 3 years. I want it in 5 years. But their report also has a footnote that says thereafter, for the next few years, we expect growth rates between 20 and 25% per year. So then I go project out on top of the 715, another 2 years of 20% growth, another 2 years of 25% growth. And this kind of gives me a range of market size in 5 years per what IDC has told me. Make sense? Now I want to get a market share of Dropbox conditional on success. And I say 10%. Now, how do I get this 10%? I do a pretty simple calculation. Honestly, I don't know what else I can do. The way I build this is I basically say, how many competitors are in this market? There's 20 competitors in the market at this stage. 20 already identified competitors. And then I say, look, you know, Series A, 50% of these companies survive. So that means 20 companies now, there's 10 survivors. If I'm one of those survivors, I don't have any reason to believe I'll be the big survivor or the small survivor. So on average, the survivors will get 10%. That's literally all I did to get this number. Now we could quibble, is this reasonable or not? Like you might say, but wait a second. Yeah, the 20 players here, they're all these little dinky pieces of shit. But I hear Google's interested in this. I hear Apple is interested in this. They come in, I'm not sure. Seems like this lowers your market share. Point well taken. So you might believe that the numbers I get you here are too large if you're really worried about that threat, right? It's all about the narrative, right? My calculation here is not worried about that narrative. If you are worried about it, you could say something like, I think the big guys are coming in and I think they're going to take 40% of the market. There's only 60% of the market left. And if there's only 60% of the market and it's got to be split 10 ways, that's 6% per survivor. Then all of a sudden you're going to get a 40% lower valuation than I got. Okay, so you can do that. That is like fair. That is a fair critique of this valuation. Let's not pretend that these things are super scientific. And actually, you know what? I can also assure you that when you're doing these valuations, you're actually doing many valuations with a bunch of different narratives in mind. Right? So look, I do valuations like this for consulting stuff. And every single time I deliver them, I mean, I did one last weekend, right? I did one last weekend and I delivered 28 narratives. And then I walked the CEO and the CFO through all 28 narratives and told them, you guys are in a better position to judge which of these narratives is most accurate or which one you want to try to advocate for to a potential investor. So you go pick the narrative yourself, but conditional on your narrative, you now know the valuation, right? That's how, by the way, this is how even valuation gets done for large companies, but it's just even more so here. Folks okay with what I'm saying? So 10%, right? That's me being not afraid of Google, Apple, stuff like that. Microsoft, by the way, all of those folks entered this market, right? OneDrive, Google Drive. Oh, I actually don't know what the hell Apple's thing is. It's like, they keep asking me on my phone to like add it and I'm like, fuck no. I'm loyal to Dropbox. In any case, you know, that gives us our, you know, exit revenue conditional on success for Dropbox of between $102 and $112 million. So far, so good? This is our exit attribute. We need to multiply that by our exit target multiple to get an exit value conditional on success. Do we agree? So I'm going to get my exit target multiple first from the tech data. Remember the tech data? 5.46. So 5.46, multiply it by, if I use version 1 with the 20% growth rate from time 4 and 5, I get 562 million. Divide that by 3, 187 million for acquisition. Probability weigh those, 297.6 million. By the way, the probability weights here change because the relative probability of IPO and acquisition changes round by round. So you always want to use round specific numbers when you're doing a valuation. So the first question you always ask is, my startup, it is a typical series N. Depending on what your answer for N is, you know which data to go pick out. Because Dropbox is a typical series A here, I go pick out all the series A data. 297, plug that into the VC method. But now it's a series A, so the series A value of D is 0.6 and T is 5. That gives me about 28.4 million. Add in my 6 million raised, and that gives me a post-money valuation of about 34 million. Notice they had raised at 29 million. So, you know, this number seems a little bit high. It's even higher when we use the 25% rate instead of the 20. It takes us up to 111 times 5.46 takes us to 609, divided by 3, 203, probability weight 322. Plug in 322 into the VC method, gives us 30.8. Add the 6 million, 36.8. We okay with this so far? I now do the exact same thing, but instead of using the tech industry data, I use that SaaS data that I had before. Right? I now look at this SaaS data, but remember, now we're in 2008, so I update my data set. I now include everything up through 2008. And if I calculate my average EV to revenue multiple for everything between 2004 and 2008, I get 8.45. Notice that is substantially bigger than the 5.46 number that I had before. So I'm going to get higher valuations now, right? Because I take the 102, multiplied by 8.45, that gives me 870, divide by 3, 290, probability weight with these numbers, 460. Plug in 460 into the VC method, 44. Add 6, about 50. Same thing when I do it. I'm saying it fast because it's the same thing over and over again with just one number changed each time, okay? But with the 25% growth rate, the V2, right, I get myself ultimately about a $54 million valuation. So those are the ranges of valuations that I have and the valuations I've done here, right? Post-money valuations ranging from $34 to $54 million. So a $29 million valuation that Dropbox actually raised at may sound a little bit low. Remember, you know, my valuations ignored Google, Apple, and Microsoft entering in the market. So you could justify a drop just on the basis of that. So that's probably one thing that was happening. There's no doubt, like Dropbox was always asked by investors, well, you know, aren't the big companies going to go into this? I mean, certainly Google, there was a thought, right? There was no reason that Google shouldn't be doing something like that, given that they were already having Gmail, right? So that was always a question. So that probably would lower it a bit. So if I wanted to clean this up more, I would probably put a little bit of thought into what I would think the market share taken by the big guys were, and I would ratchet down my valuation by that much. But there's another thing happening here that leads to a lower valuation. What's the date here? October 2008. What do you know about 2008?
The world was in shambles.
Yeah, financial crisis, right? Financial crisis affects public markets. Public markets affect private markets. Money was tight. Literally, Sequoia. Was it Sequoia? Yeah, it was Sequoia. What was it called? Just do a Google search. Sequoia end of good days, or like Sequoia financial crisis presentation. They literally gave a presentation to all of their portfolio companies saying like, folks, the world is changing, focus a little bit less on growth and, protect your burn rate because this is going to be rough. So, if they're saying this to the companies they've already invested in, what kind of valuations do you think they're offering to the companies they're thinking of investing in? Right? Lower valuations, right? The financial crisis played a role in lowering valuations temporarily. It turns out that tech private investing recovered pretty quickly. It recovered surprisingly quickly from the financial crisis. But we didn't know this at this time. And so because of that, that's another justification for why we have our valuations here looking higher than what Dropbox was actually able to raise money at. But generally speaking, the process that I've just described here is a very typical entry point valuation for doing a valuation of a startup at this stage. Literally what I just described here, this is identically the first thing that I do when I value a Series A company. I look for data from the market. I look for forecasts from management. Then I do every step that I described here, every single one. It's not my final answer because I start trying to refine my narrative, right? I start thinking about the narrative, Google, Apple, yada, yada are coming in. How does that adjust my valuation? And then I look at the narrative, oh man, the start of hard times because of the financial crisis. Let me try to get a sense of how that might be compressing valuations as well. I start thinking about those things to further refine this entry point valuation. In this course, we're going to be focusing on entry point valuation. We don't have the time or really the data to do refined valuations, because to do refined valuations, you need to be able to ask questions to management. You need to be able to reach out to consultancies. You need to have a lot of data that we just have no business getting here, right? But what I would say is you want to know the basic entry valuation like this. You want to know how to do it correctly. And everything here, is correct. And then you want to know why you would actually want to go deeper than that in the real world, because there are all these other considerations that are kind of left out from the basic entry point, right? Oh, is there a higher probability of failure than a normal Series A? Do we expect this company to have a more than typical dilution in the future? If you expect more dilution than usual in the future, then should you ask for a lower valuation or a higher valuation?
Lower.
Lower valuation, right? You're like, what the hell? I mean, my 10% will only be 1% at exit, so I'm not willing to pay you that much. Versus like, oh, my 10% is going to still be 7%. By the way, why am I saying this? You guys remember when we talked about blitz scaling? So if you see a company that's blitz scaling, do you expect more than typical dilution or less than typical dilution? More than typical dilution, right? Because those folks are burning money so damn fast that they need to keep raising more and more and more and more. Like, that means they're going to have to sell off a lot of the company. That's not necessarily a bad thing because they're blitz scaling for a reason. This is a gigantic opportunity. But like holding the giganticness of the opportunity fixed, you're going to apply a higher value of D than normal because you expect a higher amount of dilution than normal. right? So these are the things I think about when it comes to like further refining my valuation. I ask myself, like, what's peculiar about this company? And is that peculiarity value relevant? And by the way, one of the things that makes the, going into deeper nuance, like pretty much impossible to teach, is not just that it's impossible to get the data without having an in on the company or something like that. It's because it's difficult to teach because every single company you go and try to do this for, you'll end up doing subtly different things. We wish things were one size fits all. And literally in my life experience, every time I go to the deep, more nuanced stuff, it's literally been one size fits one. As in, like, what I end up doing, the narratives I spill out, that combination of narratives that I focus on as a deliverable for my client, I've never had that combination of narratives with any of my past clients. There's never been an exact carbon copy, not a single time. Right? And that makes it difficult to teach because it's just kind of like, and the thing is, I'm not even sure if I've done it right. I've tried my best, right? But, another person just as competent, more competent than me, like almost surely would come up with a different combination of narratives, right? Who's right? Who's wrong? Who knows? Time will tell. Don't know. Actually, time might not tell because I might have been right at the time and then COVID happens that no one could have forecasted. And all of a sudden my narratives prove wrong. That doesn't mean I was wrong at the time. These are all tricky things, right? So, yeah, I'm going to end things here. Actually, maybe I should say one thing to you guys. I give a specific name to what we did here. This is what I call an exit-based comparables valuation with top-down forecasting. Because I got my exit attribute, my exit revenue, using top-down approach instead of bottom-up. That's why I'm telling you guys that we're going to have 3 different ways to do exit-based comparables. Unconditional, that was our first thing. So unconditional exit-based comparables. Conditional exit-based comparables with top-down forecasting. That's what we just did. And then what we're going to do in our next valuation is going to be conditional exit comps valuation with bottom-up forecasting. So we're going to be looking at internal data from Dropbox instead of overall data from the market. And we're going to do that later, at a later date, because at a later date in 2009, in 2011, in those later dates, we're going to have operating history on Dropbox that allows us to build an internal forecast. By the way, this goes to the heart of my statement of a life cycle of valuation. Super early stage, you can't do better than unconditional. Beggars cannot be choosers. A little bit more in the middle, you don't have internal data to do a forecast, but you have market data to do a forecast. So you do exit-based comparable with top-down. And then later on, once you have enough personal internal company history to build a bottom-up forecast, typically you do both the top-down and the bottom-up. You don't do just one because you know neither is perfect and both are informative. So if both are informative but neither is perfect, you do both. And you just kind of decide, it's a judgment call, which of the two you put more weight on. Make sense to folks? So yeah, next lecture, we're going to do a couple of different Dropbox valuations where we go conditional exit comps, but with bottom-up forecasting. All right? All right, so this wraps up our lecture for today. I hope you guys have a good remainder of the week and a good weekend. By the way, side note, there was, you guys might remember, I think I sent an email about this, but there was a an event that I held yesterday with a really amazing tech executive called Kevin Taweel. That event was recorded. My expectation is that by tomorrow, I'm going to post it on YouTube so that I'll share a link with you guys so that, anyone who wasn't able to come, you can maybe check it out. I think it was a pretty interesting event. And I think it's an interesting event that covered topics that you guys as finance majors, for instance, probably virtually never think about. But these are things that startup founders and VCs will tell you morning, noon, and night that this stuff is relevant to think about, that it's relevant for being a successful entrepreneur, startup founder, that it's relevant for knowing how you should be coaching the founders of the companies you've invested in and how you should be sizing up those founders. So, if you want to like think about someone who was really good on the effing good boss framework, Kevin is really, really good. Supremely good on the non-cognitive dimensions of it. I mean, off the charts. So, if you guys listen to the video that we had about Inovia, where we had Mia and Alex come talk about things. Alex in particular, at some point talks about EQ, right? He talks about EQ as something you look for. That's the emotional quotient. That's one way of saying, non-cognitive, okay? And he talks about like VCs need to have it. But every VC will say like, yeah, a VC may need it, but a founder needs it even more, right? Like, Alex was actually at the event with Kevin Taweel, right? So I just messaged him while Kevin was talking. I was like, Alex, Kevin is the dictionary definition of EQ. And he was like, oh yeah, I totally get it, right? So if you want to have a sense of like really good EQ, just try to like get a sense of how Kevin's mind works and how he interacts with people from that event. I mean, that's, by the way, I do this pretty often with like YouTube videos of like prominent folks, is I look at the video and I focus less on what they say and I focus more on like their demeanor, their thought process in a broader manner to try to say to myself, what should I look for in an amazing founder? Right? I think Kevin is really good material for trying to think about this because he's really one of the most widely respected technology executives in the Bay Area. I mean, he started a company from zero. It's still private. So I didn't know this, but he quoted the number in the event yesterday. Ashorian is currently worth $25 billion. He's the founder. He's the person who ran the thing, for the past 25 years. $1 billion a year of market cap. Not bad. So check it out. I mean, I recommend checking it out. You don't need to check it out for this course. It's not mandatory in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's a worthwhile thing. I think I've collapsed the video down to an hour and 15 minutes. You listen to it at 2x speed. That's less than 40 minutes. Less than 70. Shit, I'm tired. Yeah, it's less than 40 minutes. That's correct.